imagine you are standing in this really high-end dealership, right?
Right.
And you are staring at this glossy, beautifully printed brochure for a brand new top-of-the-line car.
Right. The kind that smells like expensive leather just looking at it.
Exactly. And you're reading about all these award-winning safety features. I mean,
Right.
the reinforced steel chassis, the state-of-the-art LiDAR sensors, the pristine 5-star crash test ratings. It all sounds just, completely flawless.
Sure.
So you pay this astronomical sticker price, you drive the car off the lot, and then the unthinkable happens. You get into a severe collision.
Oh, yeah.
But in that split second of impact, you realize the airbags do not deploy. Why? Because they were never even installed.
Wow.
The steering wheel shears right off the column because the bolts were made of cheap plastic. The brakes, it turns out, were fundamentally incompatible with the transmission.
Which is terrifying.
It is. And that terrifying disconnect between the highly funded, award-winning specifications you were sold and the actual mechanical reality of the vehicle you are trapped in, that is the exact disconnect we are exploring today in the realm of public safety.
Right.
Specifically, we're looking at the infrastructure of Macon and Bibb County, Georgia.
Yeah, and it really is a critical engineering problem, but applied to human lives.
Right.
Because, we tend to view our municipal systems like law enforcement, emergency dispatch, the courts, as this seamless piece of
You
machinery.
expect it to just work.
Exactly. You put your tax dollars in,
Yeah.
you get public safety out. But when you start actually pulling the blueprints apart, you realize that these components are often completely siloed.
Like the engine doesn't talk to the brakes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when you apply stress to that system, the systemic friction doesn't just cause a minor breakdown. It can actually actively harm the very people it is engineered to protect.
So, addressing you listening right now, have you ever thought about the actual mechanical sequence of events that is triggered the moment you dial 911 in a panic?
Most people haven't. They just expect an instantaneous, perfectly calibrated response.
Right. But today, in this deep dive, we are going to trace that sequence backward.
Yes, we are.
We are going to deconstruct the anatomy of a local public safety collapse. And if you look at the source notes we're pulling from today, they literally read like documentary titles.
They really do.
I mean, we've got documents here titled When 911 Doesn't Answer and The Illusion of Help and Anatomy of a Public Safety Collapse.
Which sound dramatic, but they are literal descriptions of the documents in front of us.
Right. So, okay, let's unpack this. We are going to start at the very top, looking at a towering 9-figure municipal budget, and we are going to trace the wiring all the way down to the gritty reality on the streets.
And that includes looking at systemic dispatch failures, audio recordings of officers operating just entirely outside their operational bounds.
Which is wild audio, by the way.
It is chilling. And then we'll look at the federal government's attempt to legislate that street-level behavior. And finally, what happens when local police encounter complex modern cybercrimes and simply diagnose the victim with a mental illness because the crime just doesn't fit their training matrix.
It's a lot to cover, so let's jump right into the foundation of it all. To understand how a system fails its citizens, you kind of have to understand how it is fueled, right?
Absolutely. The foundation of any municipal government is its budget.
Right.
Because a budget is not just a ledger of numbers. It is a structural diagram of priorities. So we are examining the fiscal year 2026 Macon and Bibb County Budget Ordinance.
Proposed by Mayor Lester M. Miller.
Right.
And the scale of this financial blueprint is just, it really is. And if we look at just the general fund, which is basically the main operating artery of the local government, powered largely by about $193.5 million in property and local taxes, that alone totals nearly $219.8 million.
Okay, so let's break down the mechanics of where that capital actually flows.
Yeah.
Because the numbers tell a very specific story.
Let's hear it.
The sheriff's office receives the absolute lion's share of this money by a wide margin. They are drawing $56.7 million.
Wow. Okay, $56.7 million.
Right. And to contextualize that, the fire department is allocated $34 million.
Okay.
And the E-911 fund, which is the system's actual intake valve, right?
Okay.
The very first point of contact for any citizen in distress.
The most crucial part when you're in trouble.
Exactly. That sits at just $4.2 million.
Wait, so $56 million for the sheriff, but only $4 million to actually answer the phone when someone calls for the sheriff?
Yes. On paper, it looks heavily funded at the top, but the intake is highly bottlenecked. But honestly, the raw numbers only tell half the story here.
Right, because I am looking at the organizational chart for fiscal year 2026. And the chain of command seems highly fragmented.
Highly fragmented is a good way to put it.
Yeah, because at the very top, you have the citizens of Macon and Bibb County. They elect the mayor, who oversees the county manager. But off to the side, completely separated by a different reporting line, you have the elected county officials.
Which is exactly where Sheriff David Davis sits.
Right.
And this is a crucial structural reality in local government that I think a lot of people overlook.
How so?
Well, an elected sheriff operates with a degree of autonomy that an appointed municipal police chief just does not have.
Oh, because a police chief can be fired by a mayor?
Exactly. If crime goes up or if a huge apartment scandal breaks, the mayor or the city council can just fire the police chief. But a sheriff answers only to the voters during election cycles.
So they're basically an independent island.
Pretty much. So you have a $56.7 million law enforcement apparatus operating as an independent political entity within the broader county structure. The mayor controls the overall purse strings, sure, but the operational oversight of that $56 million is largely insulated.
Which creates an immediate potential for a massive oversight vacuum.
Precisely.
And it's not just the general fund either. There are parallel revenue streams heavily supplementing this infrastructure. I mean, you have the American Rescue Plan grant funds adding another $21.7 million, and SEDUA's funds adding $73.6 million.
Right. And we really should clarify how SPLOST functions here, because it directly feeds into that illusion of functionality we talked about with the CAR brochure.
Yeah, explain SPLOST for people who might not know.
So SPLOST stands for Special Purpose Local Option Sales Tax. It is a 1% sales tax that voters approve for very specific capital outlay projects.
Like buildings and stuff.
Exactly. Crucially, SPLOST can buy physical things. You can build a brand new jail wing, you can buy a shiny fleet of new patrol cruisers or upgrade radio towers, but by law, it cannot pay for operating expenses.
Wait, really?
Really. It cannot pay the salaries of the deputies driving those cruisers or the dispatchers answering those radios.
Oh, wow. So you can have a system that looks incredibly robust from the outside, brand new vehicles, state-of-the-art facilities, all these heavily funded capital projects.
It looks exactly like the brochure for our luxury car.
Right. And the public relations apparatus absolutely reflects that gleam. I mean, here's a detail. The Macon Bibb E-911 Center was actually named the Center of the Year by the Georgia Association of Public Safety Communications Officers.
Which sounds fantastic until you look at the metric for that award. It's incredibly revealing.
Yeah, because the media coverage featured the E-911 director at the time, Dr. Keith Moffitt, and he was basically praising his team of 13 on-call employees.
13 for an entire consolidated city-county government.
Exactly. He explained they were managing the complexities of this massive consolidation, which happened back in 2014, and they were feeling an 18% increase in total call volume.
Right.
But wait, let me just push back on this. How does handling an 18% increase in calls with just 13 on-call employees automatically equate to Center of the Year?
It's a great question.
I mean, if a restaurant serves 10,000 meals in a single night, they might break a volume record, right? But if 8,000 of those meals are raw, you wouldn't give them a Michelin star.
No, you wouldn't.
So are these bureaucratic awards actually measuring the delivery of safety or just the administrative ability to absorb volume?
You've hit the exact friction point of this entire system. Bureaucratic metrics often measure intake and administrative integration. They don't measure output and efficacy.
Right.
The award recognized their ability to just keep the system online under immense pressure. But answering a phone call is merely the very first step of an emergency response.
It's not the actual help.
Exactly. If the system answers your call, but lacks the operational capacity to dispatch a unit to you, the system has failed the end user, regardless of the fancy plaque on the wall.
And that brings us to the moment of impact. When you actually stress test this $460 million award-winning infrastructure, it fractures.
It really does.
The facade of functionality breaks down completely because in reality, Mayor Miller and Sheriff Davis eventually had to fundamentally restructure the 911 Center. They had to move it directly under the sheriff's office's management.
Right, because the system was fundamentally failing.
Because the integration of the city and county governments was causing just a catastrophic logistical failure.
Yeah, let's examine the mechanics of that 2014 consolidation because it's vital context. Merging a city and a county government is almost always sold to taxpayers as this great cost-saving efficiency measure.
Streamlining, right.
Right, but logistically,
Right.
it is like trying to merge two massive corporate IT networks that run on completely different operating systems.
Oh, what a nightmare.
It is. You're taking city police protocols, county sheriff protocols, different dispatch software, completely different radio frequency assignment, and trying to force all of that through a single $4.2 million intake valve.
It's bound to bottleneck.
And it did.
Yeah.
Sheriff Davis explicitly stated that accurately tracking response times became basically impossible because the dispatch system was operating under, quote, 2 or 3 umbrellas.
2 or 3 umbrellas. I want to focus on what impossible to track actually means for you, the listener, the person who might actually be needing help.
Yeah, let's look at the human reality of that.
We have the account of a citizen, Ben Walker. He gets into a fender bender on Pionono Avenue. He calls 911.
Standard procedure.
Right. And he waits. 30 minutes go by. An hour goes by. He calls back, and dispatch tells him there are 0 units available.
0.
0. An hour and a half passes. Eventually, he just completely bypasses this entire local $460 million infrastructure and calls the Georgia State Patrol.
And they arrive in 20 minutes.
20 minutes. But here's the most astonishing part to me. Hours later, long after Walker has gone home, the county 911 center calls him back to ask if he still needs an officer.
The breakdown in the feedback loop there is what is truly terrifying.
It's an administrative black hole.
It really is.
And I want to point out, this wasn't an isolated incident happening only to, everyday citizens without political leverage. Mayor Lester Miller himself stated on the record that during a medical emergency involving a relative, he called 911, was placed on hold, called back, and the call dropped entirely.
The chief executive of the county.
Yes. The mayor had to physically drive his car to a sheriff's department location just to get a human being to initiate a response.
Which just shows you that when the infrastructure fails, it doesn't care who you are. And when you look at the systemic pressure this creates, the human toll on the dispatch operators becomes so obvious.
Well, you must be so stressed.
Imagine being an E-911 center operator. You cannot function if you're constantly buffering between panicked citizens and a jurisdictional mess that leaves absolutely no units available to send them.
Right, you're just absorbing trauma with no solution.
Exactly. And so, predictably, the center was bleeding staff. The county eventually moved to terminate the E-911 director, Shandell Graham. They cited severe morale issues and just constant turnover.
And she just verbally resigned immediately upon being notified of the pending termination, right?
Yes.
But let me just push back on the timeline here for a second, because this is wild to me. If a dispatch center has a toxic culture, a mass exodus of staff, a total inability to accurately track how fast officers respond, and a system so clogged that the mayor himself gets put on hold during a medical crisis?
Yeah.
How on earth does a state association evaluate that and decide it represents the pinnacle of public safety communications? I mean, center of the year.
It's a massive disconnect. But it speaks to how insulated these professional associations can be from the ground-level user experience.
They're just looking at spreadsheets.
Right. The evaluation likely focused on the monumental administrative task of managing the 2014 consolidation's software and personnel integration. They weren't looking at the elapsed time between a citizen's cry for help and a deputy's actual arrival.
So they rewarded the effort of managing a crisis, not the resolution of the crisis itself.
Exactly.
It's unbelievable. But, the delayed response is really only the first failure point.
It gets worse.
The second failure point is far more severe. What happens when the dispatch system finally does work? What happens when that $56.7 million law enforcement budget manifests in your driveway, but the operators of that system have lost all operational discipline?
This is where we have to look at the reality on the ground.
Right. We have an open records request here, just FOIA request number SO 2024-611. And this details a May 2019 incident at the Macon Inn on Riverside Drive.
And we should warn you, listening to this, the details here are deeply disturbing.
Very much so. The deputies involved in this incident are Deputy Lee W. Rohrbach, Deputy Worcester, and Deputy Min Ha. The citizen they are interacting with is a woman named Dana Lynn Joyner.
And the audio transcript from these body cameras is a stark, unvarnished look at the behavioral culture within a subset of this department.
We are going to quote directly from the official transcript. It begins with a 4-second hot mic clip from Deputy Rohrbach.
Right.
He has just been in a physical altercation with Joyner. He is breathing heavily. He's complaining about an injury to his left eye, and he says loudly and clearly on the mic, "I beat the shit out of her face."
We really have to analyze the psychology of that statement, because law enforcement officers are, of course, legally authorized to use force.
Right, that's part of the job.
But that force is strictly defined as compliance-driven. You use force to neutralize a threat or effect an arrest, and the absolute moment compliance is achieved, the force stops.
It's not supposed to be punishment.
Exactly. The phrasing Rohrbach uses is not the language of trained compliance. It is the language of retaliatory punitive violence. He is not saying, I subdued the suspect. He is literally boasting about inflicting trauma in response to his eye injury.
And the culture of retaliation only escalates when his backup arrives, because Deputy Worcester gets to the scene. Joyner is already secured in the back of a patrol car at this point.
She's locked in.
Locked in. Worcester doesn't secure the perimeter. He doesn't de-escalate the situation. He approaches the back of the car, leans in, and says, "Fat bitch, I got you. You lucky. You real lucky. F you, snaggletooth bitch. Shove my baton up your ass."
This is a critical failure of supervisory structure. An officer in crisis like Rohrbach, who is injured and highly agitated, needs a secondary officer to arrive and stabilize the scene.
To calm things down.
Right. Instead, Worcester acts as an accelerant. He introduces the threat of severe sexualized violence with a baton against a securely detained citizen.
And Joyner, who, again, is locked in the back seat, asks Worcester, "What no you gonna do? Kill me?" And Worcester replies, "I don't know. Depends."
An officer of the law telling a citizen that whether he executes her or not depends.
It's chilling, and it doesn't stop there. He later turns to a bystander, Michael Anthony Tatum, who suggests she's a repeat offender, and Worcester says, she ain't gonna do it again because she's gonna go bye-bye.
The transcript reveals a complete detachment from standard operating procedure, and not just in their interaction with the citizen, but in how they even deployed to the scene in the first place.
Oh, right. Listen to how Worcester describes his arrival to another deputy. He literally brags about his driving. He says, "We were doing 140 from Hartley Bridge Road. Still wasn't fast enough."
140 miles per hour.
And another officer responds, "I didn't know that car would go that fast."
Driving a 2-ton patrol vehicle at 140 miles per hour on public roadways is a lethal risk to the entire community.
Anyone could have stepped into the street.
Exactly. The kinetic energy involved at that speed means any collision is going to be catastrophic. And why is he taking that massive risk? Not to stop an active shooter, not to save a hostage.
He's responding to a disturbance where the suspect is already being handled.
Right. It points to this adrenaline-fueled tribal response.
Yeah.
A fellow officer was hurt, and so the fundamental rules of public safety, including basic traffic laws, were entirely abandoned to rush to his defense.
You use the word tribal, and I think that's exactly what we see when they begin discussing Joyner's psychological state, because Worcester says she's mental health. Another speaker casually remarks, "She belongs in the river."
Well,
They know she has psychological issues. They even mention she might bond out of River Edge, which is a local behavioral health center, for $2.
so they are fully aware of her vulnerability.
Fully aware. They know they are dealing with a highly vulnerable person, and instead of triggering some kind of psychiatric protocol, they weaponize her illness to justify their abuse.
And this leads us to what is perhaps the most legally concerning aspect of this entire transcript:
Here's where it gets really interesting.
the mechanical construction of a cover-up.
Yes. Worcester admits on tape that he opened the patrol car door to confront Joyner. He says, "I always like to confront the suspect, ask him a question or two." He claims that while he was doing this, she spit at him, so he slammed the door in her face.
Right.
And then, standing around with his colleagues, he asks, "Can we charge her with that? Can we pile the charge, stack the charges on it?"
We really need to explain what stacking charges actually means in the mechanics of the justice system.
Please do, because it's a huge issue.
It is a highly controversial practice where an officer applies multiple, often overlapping or exaggerated criminal charges to a single event.
Just piling them on.
Exactly. The goal is geometric pressure, because in a local court system, bond amounts are often algorithmic. A single charge might carry a $500 bond. 5 stacked charges might carry a $5,000 bond.
So they price her out of freedom.
Right. By stacking charges, officers ensure the citizen cannot afford bail. They sit in jail, they risk losing their job, their housing, and the pressure to just accept a plea deal becomes immense, regardless of their actual guilt.
So Worcester is on camera, actively conspiring with other deputies to legally engineer a situation that will keep this woman incarcerated. Entirely as retaliation because he provoked her into spitting at a door after his partner injured his eye.
It's retaliatory paperwork.
And no one stops him. No one says, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't manufacture a felony charge right now." One speaker actually says, "Too bad he didn't shoot her." I mean, If the entire perimeter of officers is validating this, supporting this, and helping strategize the paperwork to cover it up,
Yeah.
is this a bad apple or is the whole orchard blighted?
You can't claim it's just a bad apple. The bad apple theory relies entirely on the premise that the surrounding apples are healthy and will naturally isolate the rot. What this audio documents is systemic complicity. The ecosystem itself is diseased. The officers feel entirely comfortable conspiring to manipulate the judicial process right out in the open because the culture of the department assures them there will be no internal consequences.
And when local municipal oversight completely fractures like that, when you have an autonomously elected sheriff, a consolidated dispatch system that can't track response times, and deputies driving 140 miles an hour to stack charges on a mental health patient.
Pressure inevitably bubbles up.
Exactly. It bubbles up to the federal level. You have to bring in an outside mechanism to force compliance.
Precisely. And that introduces the legislative component of our analysis today. Because the federal government did try to step in, we're looking at H.R. 7206, the Excessive Force Prevention and Accountability Act of 2020, which was introduced by Representative Espejo.
So this bill was drafted to amend Title 18 of the United States Code. Specifically, it seeks to add a new section, 242A, aimed at criminalizing excessive force under the color of law by law enforcement and correctional officers.
Let's define color of law really quickly, because it is the absolute linchpin of federal civil rights prosecutions.
Yeah, what does that mean in plain English?
Acting under the color of law basically means an individual is using the authority given to them by a local, state, or federal government agency. When Deputy Rohrbach uses force, he is doing so with the state's implicit backing.
He's got a badge and a gun.
Right. This bill is attempting to clearly, legally define when that state-backed force crosses the line and becomes a federal crime.
And the bill outlines different tiers of punishment. For intentional acts where an officer purposefully uses force that objectively exceeds what is reasonably necessary, the penalty is up to 10 years in prison if bodily injury occurs.
And if the action results in death, the officer faces up to life in prison.
But it doesn't just stop at intentional malice, which I think is key.
No, it introduces a standard for reckless acts as well. This is defined as an officer consciously disregarding a substantial and unjustifiable risk that their actions will result in excessive force.
So like driving 140 miles per hour through a residential zone?
Exactly. It attempts to criminalize the blatant disregard for safety. If an act is deemed reckless, the penalty is up to 5 years, or 20 years if death results.
But the most vital mechanism in this proposed legislation, and the part that directly targets the complicit ecosystem we heard on that body cam audio, is subsection C, failure to intervene.
This is huge. Historically, prosecuting officers who just stand by and watch abuse happen has been incredibly difficult.
Because of the blue wall of silence, right?
Exactly. The blue wall of silence is that unspoken cultural rule that you never, ever incriminate a fellow officer. H.R. 7206 attempts to shatter that wall with statutory weight.
How does it do that?
Subsection C mandates that if an officer is contemporaneously aware that excessive force is being used, has a reasonable opportunity to stop it, and chooses not to intervene, they're just as culpable.
They get charged, too.
Yes, they face up to 5 years in prison, or 20 years if the victim dies.
And the authors of the bill anticipated the usual defense tactics, too. Because the bill states explicitly that the rank of the officer committing the abuse is not a defense.
Which is critical. You cannot stand by while a sergeant or a captain beats a suspect and claim you were just following the chain of command.
Right. And it also dictates that the officers don't even have to be from the same agency.
Furthermore, subsection D is just fascinating from a legal standpoint. It states that ignorance of the law is a non-defense.
Okay, unpack that.
It means the prosecution does not have to prove the officer had studied Title 18 or knew the specific, nuanced constitutional parameters of the Fourth Amendment. They only have to prove the officer knew the force was excessive and chose to do nothing.
But, okay, let me push back on how this actually operates in a real courtroom, especially considering things like qualified immunity, because qualified immunity protects officers from civil lawsuits unless they violate a clearly established statutory or constitutional right. If this bill makes ignorance of the law a non-defense in a criminal proceeding, does a piece of legislation drafted in a sterile committee room in Washington, D.C. actually possess the kinetic power to override the tribal adrenaline on a street in Macon, Georgia?
I mean, that is the perpetual tension between legislative theory and street-level reality.
Trying to fix the street-level culture of policing with a document written in Washington, D.C. feels like trying to put out a forest fire by mailing it a strongly worded letter. The disconnect between the sterile language of legitimate penological function and a deputy yelling, "I beat the shit out of her" face is just massive.
It is massive. The law is designed as a deterrent. The theory is that if Deputy Worcester knows he will face 5 years in federal prison for failing to stop Deputy Rohrbach, that federal threat will override his tribal loyalty to his partner.
But does it?
Well, as you noted, human beings in high-stress, high-adrenaline situations rarely run a complex risk analysis matrix on the U.S. Code before they act.
Right, they just react.
A law like H.R. 7206 provides a mechanism for accountability after the tragedy has already happened, but it's powered to proactively break a deeply entrenched local culture. That is highly debatable.
And physical brutality, the kind that leaves physical scars and obvious visceral body cam evidence, that is really only one vector of a system's failure.
That's true.
Because sometimes the failure isn't an officer throwing a punch. Sometimes the failure is a complete willful dismissal of modern problems, a complete institutional inability to comprehend the modern world, followed by the psychological gaslighting of the citizen who is just asking for help.
We are shifting our focus now to a completely different type of public safety collapse.
Yeah.
We are looking at a computer-aided dispatch, or CAD, report from the Bibb County Sheriff's Office. This is incident number 2023-0000004312, which took place in the early hours of January 16, 2023.
And the narrative of this call is just surreal. At 4:41 a.m., a citizen named Steve Faircloth dials 911.
Okay.
He is not reporting a burglary or an assault. He is reporting a highly sophisticated, multi-layered cyber intrusion on his personal network and devices.
Right.
And he provides the dispatcher with highly specific terminology. He reports an active SOCKS proxy operating on port 1080. He reports an unauthorized enterprise license manager running on his machine and an enterprise tracking number that he believes is linked to the cloning of his phone's eSIM card.
We really need to explain exactly what these terms mean so you, the listener, understand why Faircloth's concern was entirely valid and real.
Yeah, translate the tech for us.
So an eSIM is a digital SIM card in your phone. If someone clones it, they effectively hijack your entire phone number.
Which means they get your texts.
Exactly. Allowing them to intercept your text messages, which includes two-factor authentication codes for your bank accounts, your email, everything.
That's terrifying.
It is. And a SOCKS proxy on port 1080. That is a networking protocol that routes internet traffic through a third-party server. If an unauthorized proxy is active on a personal device, it means someone else is routing their own data through your machine, essentially masking their identity behind yours.
So they could be committing crimes and making it look like you did it?
Yes, this is industrial-grade cybercrime.
So Faircloth is providing concrete, verifiable digital forensics to 9/11. And what is the response from the $460 million infrastructure?
Well, he waits.
He waits out in the freezing cold for over an hour. At 6:20 a.m., he calls dispatch again to ask where the officer is. Finally, at 6:42 a.m., Unit 1A15 arrives.
And who is driving that unit?
This is the crazy part. It is Deputy Minha, the exact same deputy who was present at the May 2019 body cam incident where charges were stacked on Dana Joyner.
Small world, right?
Very. And the resolution of this call perfectly illustrates the institutional defense mechanism of a police force confronting its own obsolescence. Because at 6:47 a.m., 5 minutes after arriving, Deputy Hag clears the scene. The official notes state that he advised Faircloth never to call 911 again and told him to just file a report online.
But the truly damaging action is the bureaucratic label they attach to the file.
Right. The dispatcher, with the approval of the responding supervisor, Secate David Patterson, officially categorizes Faircloth's call under the designation demented person.
Demented person.
They called him crazy.
Because they lacked the technical training to understand what a SOKS proxy or an eSIM clone was, the officers experienced immense cognitive dissonance.
It didn't fit the script.
The crime did not fit their operational matrix of domestic disputes, traffic violations, and physical theft. So rather than admitting they lacked the jurisdiction or the basic knowledge to help, they simply pathologized the victim.
They used his advanced vocabulary against him.
Exactly. They classified his technical report as a psychiatric delusion.
It is the ultimate form of institutional gaslighting. And we actually have the written response from Faircloth. He claims to hold a CIS, Computer Information Systems degree. And his response, which is addressed to the Bibb County Sheriff's Office Cyber Aversion Team, is just a masterpiece of dark, justified sarcasm.
It really is. He systematically dismantles their psychiatric diagnosis using raw network data.
Right.
He writes about his, quote, hallucinations, which he points out are simply the active processes running on his HP ZBook workstation.
Yeah, viable processes.
Yes. He points out the unauthorized license manager operating on port 1083, which was trapping his system in a continuous authentication loop. He notes that his device's IMEI, which is its unique hardware identifier, was registered in an enterprise management database that was actively routing his private traffic through the University System of Georgia network.
He writes, and this line is incredible to me, since the FBI was too busy hanging up on me to care about eSIM cloning, and the BCSO is too busy labeling victims demented, I am hoping this portal is slightly more sentient. Please have someone who understands what a man-in-the-middle proxy is look at these logs.
And a man-in-the-middle proxy is a very real, very dangerous attack where the perpetrator secretly relays and alters the communications between two parties who believe they are directly communicating with each other.
It's highly sophisticated data interception.
It is. Faircloth was handing them the digital equivalent of a smoking gun and a bloody fingerprint, and they literally told him he was insane.
But the irony of this situation reaches a devastating peak when Faircloth researches the supervisor who validated his demented person label.
Chief Patterson.
Right. Faircloth points out that Sergeant David Patterson has a well-documented public record of severe operational failure. Patterson was previously documented as delaying the rescue of a bludgeoning victim for 2 hours while investigators processed a crime scene, basically prioritizing the perimeter over the victim's immediate medical survival.
Which really forces us to look at the massive gap between the public safety infrastructure we fund and the reality of modern victimization.
So if your house is broken into, the cops might take 3 hours to show up. But if your phone is broken into, they show up just to diagnose you with a mental illness. Where is a citizen supposed to turn?
It's a terrifying question.
Yeah.
We are financing a law enforcement apparatus that is heavily trained for physical, street-level confrontation. But as our lives migrate entirely onto digital networks, local police are fundamentally unequipped to secure that frontier.
They just don't have the tools.
No. When an officer whose primary tool is a firearm or a baton is presented with a network intrusion, the system collapses into denial. They label the victim demented to close the ticket quickly, ensuring their administrative clearance rates remain acceptable to the higher-ups.
And what happens to all these stacked charges, these dismissed cybercrimes and excessive force reports? They don't just go away. They get funneled into the legal system.
Right, they are handed over to the prosecutors.
Managed by human beings with their own complex histories. Because this is where we have to demystify the justice system. The court system is not an infallible, omniscient supercomputer that automatically sorts truth from fiction.
No, it's not.
It is an administrative processing plant operated by human beings. Human beings who carry their own complex histories, biases, and extreme personal vulnerabilities.
And to contextualize who exactly is processing this information, we reviewed a background report for an individual within the Bibb County judicial system. Specifically, a Truth Finder report for a woman named Rebecca Lyles Grist.
And we are looking at this information completely impartially. The goal here is not to attack or judge her character, but to ground the abstract concept of the prosecution into a tangible human reality.
Exactly. According to the public record, Rebecca Lyles Grist is 57 years old. She holds a Juris Doctor from the Mercer University Walter F. George School of Law, and since 2014, she has been employed as an Assistant Solicitor General in Bibb County.
So what does an Assistant Solicitor General actually do?
Well, the Solicitor General's office is the exact jurisdiction that prosecutes misdemeanor offenses, which is the precise type of charges that are often generated during messy confrontational arrests, like the one we heard on the body cam audio. So an Assistant Solicitor General is a vital gear in this exact machine. They review the arrest narratives written by the deputies and decide whether to bring the full weight of the state against the citizen.
But the public records also reveal the intense financial pressures this specific gear has operated under. The report shows that in October 2005, she filed for both Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcies.
And we should distinguish between those two filings to really understand the financial reality here.
Please do.
A Chapter 7 bankruptcy is a total liquidation of non-exempt assets to clear unsecured debt.
Yeah.
It's starting over from scratch.
Right.
A Chapter 13 bankruptcy is a reorganization, creating a strict court-mandated repayment plan over 3 to 5 years. Filing for both indicates a period of profound financial distress and structural reorganization of one's entire livelihood.
It's incredibly stressful.
The records also show state tax liens released in the mid-2000s, alongside various mortgages on properties in Macon and Milledgeville.
And it reminds us that the wizard behind the curtain of the justice system is just a person pulling levers. They have mortgages and past bankruptcies, just like the citizens they are prosecuting.
Exactly. Imagine the systemic pressure. When a file lands on an assistant solicitor general's desk containing 3 stacked charges against a citizen, they have to decide whether to trust the police narrative or launch an independent inquiry into the officer's conduct.
Which takes time.
It takes immense time, energy, and political capital. Resources that an overwhelmed prosecutor dealing with their own life pressures may simply not have.
So the easiest path is just to push it through.
The easiest path is often to accept the police report as fact and push for a plea deal. The human vulnerability of the prosecutor becomes the final seal on the systemic failure.
Wow. So let's look back at the entire mechanical sequence we just reverse engineered in this deep dive. We started with the glossy brochure, a massive $460.2 million municipal budget for Macon and Bibb County.
Right.
We saw $56.7 million handed to an autonomously elected sheriff and $4.2 million allocated to a 911 center, boasting a shiny Center of the Year award.
And we watched that facade completely collapse under operational stress. We explored how the logistical nightmare of a city-county consolidation led to 911 calls dropping into the void, leaving citizens stranded and local mayors running to police stations for help.
We listened to the unvarnished reality of the street culture. Deputies driving 140 miles an hour, bragging about excessive physical violence, hurling misogynistic threats, mocking mental health vulnerabilities, and actively conspiring to weaponize the legal system by stacking charges against a citizen.
And then we examined the federal government's attempt to rein in that exact culture with H.R. 72006. We analyzed the friction between the theoretical mandate to intervene and the deeply entrenched street-level tribalism that makes prosecuting the blue wall of silence so incredibly difficult.
We analyzed the absolute absurdity of a $56 million police force encountering a sophisticated digital intrusion, CCKS proxies, eSIM cloning, man-in-the-middle attacks, and responding by officially labeling the tech-savvy victim a demented person.
Yeah.
And finally, we saw how all of this chaotic, deeply flawed paperwork is funneled to prosecutors who are just ordinary humans navigating their own financial and personal turbulence.
All of this analysis leads to a final, deeply unsettling question for you to mull over.
What's
Every single breakdown we discussed today, the dropped calls, the malicious body cam audio, the dismissed cybercrime, the federal legislation. We only know about these things because a record was created and preserved.
right? We are analyzing the paper trail.
But as technology advances, the ability to erase that trail advances with it. As crime moves entirely into the digital realm, like the SOCKS proxies Faircloth reported, and as physical policing faces heavier litigation, how much is simply vanishing?
Oh, that's a dark thought.
If a network intrusion leaves no physical damage, or if an officer simply mutes a microphone, or if a dispatcher clears a call from the server without generating a formal report, what happens to the truth? Are we continuing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into a 20th century physical infrastructure to fight an invisible 21st century reality, and then punishing the citizens who are perceptive enough to notice that the airbags were never installed?
It leaves you standing in that dealership, holding the keys to a machine you now realize you cannot trust. The brochure promises you an award-winning safety system. The tax bill proves you paid for it. But when the impact comes, the only thing you can be absolutely certain of is that you are entirely on your own.